The trajectory to become a full-fledged serial killer is long and crooked. It's not something that happens overnight, but very few cases are as prolific and increasingly violent as the case of the Golden State Killer. This case is a big mess to tackle and to structure, but I've always wanted to talk about it, and I feel that now is the right time to do it. So why don't you buckle up for a very special installation of Ages of Murder. The year was 1972, and in the community of Rancho Cordova a string of odd burglaries were committed. These weren't ordinary burglaries, they were cat burglaries. A cat burglar is someone that enters a house even if the homeowners might be at home at the time, so it takes some skill and stealth to commit such crimes and get away with it. This specific cat burglar, known only by the name of Rancho Cordova cat burglar, was an odd fellow. He usually entered a house at night and would spend time going through possessions as families lay sleeping. He would even spend time inside the bedrooms of sleeping occupants without waking them up. A real creep. He didn't really steal much of value. Sure, he took some purses, wallets and coin collections. He would later dump the empty wallets and purses from several houses he had burglarized in the same night in a yard. Sometimes though, the cat would take smaller, personal items from the wallets he looted, as well as take food and alcohol. Big deal. A cat burglar who liked to spend time in bedrooms with sleeping strangers. What does any of that has to do with an infamous serial killer? Well, to be honest, it may not have anything to do with the Golden State Killer at all, but there are things in the MO that tells a different story. I'm not going to sit and compare MOs each time the subject pops up. Just pay attention and you'll see it too, as we walk this long, winding road together. The Rancho Cordova cat would often enter the houses through a sliding glass door or side door. Once inside, he created several exit points for himself by opening windows and pulling the window screens inside, so that they couldn't be seen from outside. A pretty smart move, because he did have to use these exits a couple of times when he accidentally woke up sleeping homeowners. A quick and stealthy escape when being pursued. But the cat got brazen. The first connection to a sexual motivation came when a woman woke up with a man on top of her. The man was holding her breast. The woman told the man that he needed to go, and oddly enough he did. Then came a second incident. A woman was woken up by noises in her bedroom. She was home alone with her 17-year-old daughter at the time, and when she opened her eyes, she saw someone standing near her bedroom door. The stranger by the door pointed a gun at her before telling her that, "I just took $1 off your dresser." The woman responded that he should put it back and leave. The stranger again complied, but he put $2 back instead of $1. Then he made his way down the hallway but stopped and looked in the room of the sleeping 17-year-old. The girl screamed at the man that he had to leave, and again he complied. But before he left, he stole a quarter and a nickel. Then there was the Cordova Meadows burglar. First thought to have been a separate offender, this burglar acted in 1973 during periods of time when the Rancho Cordova cat burglar was inactive. He would steal piggy banks, binoculars, hunting knives, handguns, prescription medication and food, but leave other things of value in the house. This burglar also struck during all hours of the day, sometimes when the occupants were home and sometimes when they weren't. And again, this was a weird fucking guy. He once took a bottle of pills, but dumped the pills down the drain and took the empty bottle with him. He also stole car magnets for an advertisement firm. He even took photos of female occupants, and at one point stole nude photos he found. He also took single earrings from pairs. An odd thing to do. But that isn't all he did. When the burglar entered a home where there was a dog present, he would kill it, beating it to death, probably to hear if the homeowners came home. He took precautions there too, as he would put chairs against the front door or lock the security chain to give him more time to exit through one of the windows in case someone came home. He unplugged forced air furnaces too. He wanted it to be as silent as possible, so that he could hear every little thing. Another thing the burglar did was ransack the bedrooms, scattering clothes all over the floor and separate the women's underwear and stack it in a separate room. He also left burnt matches on the floor. Things even escalated into communication and harassment with the burglar and his victims, specifically with a 17-year-old girl who got a letter with the words "I love you" from an unknown sender, as well as several hang-up phone calls until the last phone call, where she heard a low voice on the other line say, "I love you. This is your last night to live." Before we move on to Visalia, we need to talk about one last incident. It was September 14, 1973, and a 28-year-old woman was home alone during the daytime as she was being with a 1-year-old son and recovering from surgery. She had been doing the laundry in the garage and had just put her son to sleep when she spotted a strange man in her backyard. She locked the door that separated the kitchen and the garage as the garage door was open, and then she heard a knock on the front door. It's probably just a religious solicitor, she thought to herself. But considering the stranger she had just seen, she wanted to be safe. She ignored the knocks and fetched her gun. Then she checked on her son. But when she entered the master bedroom, she saw the same stranger trying to pry open the window to her bedroom. The two locked eyes for a second, and then the stranger ducked and ran to the other side of the house. The woman panicked and ran around the house, locking all doors and windows. After she had secured any points of entry, she called her husband at work and told him what was going on. And then just a few minutes later, the door to the garage made a crashing noise as the security chain was broken off and the nails that held the door up from the frame base were yanked out. This guy knew how to kick down a door. The woman acted quickly and raised her gun at him and told him that if he got any closer, she would shoot him. The man turned around and simply walked away. Somewhat relieved, the woman called the police, but while she waited for them, she could hear the now broken door open, and before she could react, the man was on top of her. The two struggled for the gun as the man was hell-bent on hurting her. Eventually, the gun went off just above her shoulder, and the strange man ran out of the house for the last time. The woman fainted from the struggle. She was, after all, still recovering from her surgery, but lucky enough, the woman survived the attack. The years went on, and the cat burglar was forgotten by many, but in the small town of Visalia, someone else was lurking, prowling, and escalating. So before we move on, I just need to acknowledge something. You're probably wondering when I'm gonna talk about Joseph James Deangelo. I will. But to me the connection to Deangelo is better suited for the last chapter. But trust me, we'll get there. It began with a couple of odd accounts in the summer of 1973. That's when the town of Visalia experienced what may have been the first encounter with a man whose haunting shadow would cast a dark web of fear and uncertainty over the town for 45 years. It was in May 1973 that an odd prowler was first spotted. The prowling would later be followed up by a ransacking, something the inhabitants of Visalia would get real familiar with, as the deviant dubbed the ransacker slowly worked his way up to murder before he mysteriously disappeared in 1975. More disturbing reports came in during September of 1973. There hadn't been any ransackings done during this time period, but there was 4 reports of a prowler. The prowler had spied on 2 young females and was at one point caught by an angry boyfriend. The boyfriend confronted the stranger and talked to him, but quickly broke it off when he thought the stranger was reaching for a gun. Things simmered down, but the calmness was a lie. It was just the calm before the storm. During September of 1973, the prowler had peeped at 2 females 2 times in a row, and in January 1974, he was back to peep at one of the same young ladies. Not the one with the boyfriend, the one I never elaborated on. During January, he came back one more time, but this time he prowled on the neighbor's house. Things kept going at a slow pace, and it wasn't until March of 1974 that the next odd incident occurred. This time it was a ransacking, and it's uncertain if this one is connected to any of the others. March turned into April, and here is when the first confirmed Visalia ransacker reports start coming in. April was a busy month for the fresh evil deviant that prowled and preyed. 4 ransackings occurred during this month, but all he had taken was piggy banks. All of these burglaries had occurred when the house was empty, and the ransacker often left the windows open with the screens pulled inside to be used as exits in case he needed it. He also secured the front door to slow down any possible returning homeowners. It wasn't a strange thing for the ransacker to strike the same home more than once either, as one of these houses would be struck again in 1975. It seemed like the town had catched a virus, without knowing it was deadly. The ransackings that had occurred already was small potatoes compared to May of 1974. The ransacker struck 15 homes in 1 month. He took cash, coins and piggy banks from some of his ransackings, but others were stranger. Like the one where he took wedding cards, or the one where he took a broken necklace, a pantyhose and cologne. There was also that odd incident where he took a single earring from a pair. Seems familiar. But the oddest of all must be the 2 ransackings where he didn't steal anything at all, he just ransacked. And the ransackings in May wasn't strung out across the whole thing. 6 of the ransackings were done during a 3-day period. But the explosive outburst of May wasn't reflected in June. In June the ransacker only struck 1 home, but it didn't steal anything. But then the town of Visalia could take a breath of relief, because the ransacker was gone for 2 months. He didn't display his shadow for over 2 months, but how does that saying go again? It's always the calmest in the eye of the storm. Contrary to what some may have thought back then, the ransacker wasn't done in Visalia, not yet. And in September of 1974 he ransacked another home. This time he again took a single earring from a pair. But now he was back in the saddle again. October 1974, he was revving up and committed 6 ransackings in October, 3 of which were done on the same day. This time he had taken some cash and piggy banks, but he had also stolen 2 guns, as well as ammunition. He took 2 Kodak cameras as well, and again he left one of the ransackings empty-handed, without stealing anything. And on top of the 6 ransackings there was another report of a prowler, one of the ransacker's favorite things to do during his pastime. And naturally, October turned into November, and oh boy, was November a busy month for the Visalia ransacker. He committed 21 ransackings during November, and he started displaying disturbing signs of violence and anger. On November 1st, he struck 5 homes, taking mostly money, coins, piggy banks and stamps, but on one he stole the homeowner's alarm key to their workplace, as well as a single earring from a pair. On November 2nd, he struck 4 times. As usual, he took coins from 3 of the places. At one home, he took 4 tubes of glue, as well as a single earring from a pair. At his 3rd ransacking for the night, he took nothing at all, and for his 4th, he grabbed a pack of brand new men's t-shirts. And then he waited. He waited until Thanksgiving weekend, because during Thanksgiving weekend, he ransacked 12 homes. He took some valuable things, some ammunition as well as a shotgun, but Thanksgiving also brought out the worst in the ransacker. In one of his ransackings, he again took a single earring, some custom-made jewelry, a lady's wallet, a bra, and the most disturbing thing yet, he stole photos of the homeowner's children. He did something similar at another ransacking during Thanksgiving weekend, but this time he didn't steal the photos of the victim's children. He tore the photos up and left the torn pieces there. Besides these veiled threats, he stole a check, only payable to the homeowner from one place, and he ate bread and drank at another ransacking. He was getting bolder and seemingly angrier. As Thanksgiving weekend went on, he kept doing irrational and disturbing things. He poured out a bottle of pills into the sink at one home, and on one he again didn't steal anything, and here's where a noticeable curve starts to form. And his sexual motivations became clearer as he continued his spree in December. In December there was 13 ransackings and 3 prowling incidents in Visalia. Again, the ransacker took valuable items from some places as well as took some coins and piggy banks, but those aren't the things that's interesting about this fucking creep. It started in the middle of December, 4 ransackings in one day. Most of them could be considered normal for this guy, as a ring and valuables were taken, but then there was that one ransacking where he just didn't take anything at all, despite availability, and that's something he did throughout his entire career. He would just ignore valuables and instead steal coins or other things. The ransacker kept his streak going through the later half of December 1974. At one point he stole a shaving kit. In another home he took 4 single earrings from 4 pairs as well as binoculars. Then he started acting all creepy again when he in one home took 10-cent stamps and threw photos of the family that owned a house on the ground. And that same night he ransacked the home of another family. This time he stole keys and threw photos of the kids on the ground, but he also masturbated in the house. After jerking off, he sprayed the house with lotion. He seemed to like making a mess, and it was also clear that he got sexual gratification out of his crimes. In 2 of the ransackings on December 22nd, he on one sprayed the house with shaving cream, and on the other he stole a pair of men's pajamas. January was a calm month for the ransacker. He only committed 2 ransackings in January of 1975, and they both appeared to be pretty standard with coins, stamps and cash being taken. It is however worth to note here that one of the houses he struck in January of 75 had been struck once before and would be struck again. In February he struck 6 homes. In one of the homes he again masturbated with lotion he had brought with himself, and then he smeared the lotion all over the house and left the empty bottle there. And his plans of exit would also be put into use here, as it was during one ransacking that the homeowner came home in the middle of the burglary and scared off the ransacker. Again he took single earrings from pairs, and during one ransacking he threw photos of the family onto the floor. But in hindsight, the most disturbing thing that happened that month was the reports of the prowler. It was the first time that the prowler was spying on Claude Snelling's young daughter, but it would not be the last. March was another rather inactive month for the ransacker, as he only ransacked one home, where he stole a broken revolver. April was also calm. The only thing that happened that month was reports of a prowler, but on May 24th the ransacker struck 4 homes. He mostly took coins, stamps and cash, except for one house where he stole a revolver. And May 31st he again reared his ugly head. He only struck one home that night, but he stole 16 rings and laid out the owner's clothes on the floor and poured orange juice all over them. In June there was some suspicious activity and one ransacking, but in July 3 ransackings were committed. However, one of them is more important. At this house the ransacker was ransacking the room that sat over the garage that the victims rented, and during his ransacking he was interrupted as the 19-year-old daughter of the family all of a sudden walked into the room. The ransacker wore a ski mask and pushed the girl down before he fled. However, after this incident the ransacker started prowling and peeping on the 19-year-old girl. Eventually, all of this culminated in a police sting, which resulted in an incident that surely was a main factor in the Visalia ransacker leaving Visalia for something else. 10 more incidents occurred in August, and the signs that was being displayed kept getting darker. In one of the incidents, he took a photo of the homeowner's daughter, as well as a gold locket with a photo of their granddaughter. He also took a jar of cherries, but he dumped the jar in the yard next door. Then he took a Sunday school pin and smashed it. After he had smashed it, he placed it where the photo of the daughter had been. In another incident, he arranged cash and ammunition on the victim's bed. Then there was an incident where he had taken photos from a drawer and seems to have masturbated. He also took a flashlight that would be binding the infamous ransacker to murder, but we're not quite there just yet. In the last ransacking of August 1975, the ransacker had lined up men's underwear on the floor from the bathroom to the bedroom. He also stole a revolver. What's special about this revolver is that it would eventually become a murder weapon. All the signs were there, but hindsight is 2020, and the stage was set for the events that would unfold on September 11th, 1975. The day the Golden State Killer murdered his first victim. We all have our limits. Sure, if push comes to shove, we may go beyond that limit, but we know where it is. And we know that we are all capable of acts of evil. It's just a part of the human nature, something that has helped us to evolve and become what we are today. But some of us just has the ability to push and push and push our limits, just to find out that not only is the limit far beyond that of yours or mine, but it actually satisfies a need, an itch we never knew how to scratch. The Prowler was back again. It was in the days leading up to September 11th, 1975, that prowling activity seemed to be happening all around the Snelling residence. It seemed like the guy was scouting the place. During one of these prowlings that occurred just hours before the Prowler made his move, a ladder had been stolen, most likely used to get a bird's eye view of the place. Claude Snelling was a professor at a nearby college. He was highly respected in the community, a devoted father, a good husband, and an active church member. He would only become 45 years old. Then there was Claude's daughter, a 16-year-old high school student. Both her and the father had run-ins with the Prowler before. Several months before the attack would happen, a Prowler had been chased away by Claude Snelling, and on 7 p.m. the evening before the attack, Claude's daughter had heard noises outside the window, but it was too dark to see anything. That night were just like any other. The 16-year-old girl had her boyfriend over at the house. The air conditioner was broken, so the windows had to be open. Not that having it closed would have stopped the maniac that terrorized Visalia. He was determined to have the young girl, so the evening went on, and at 10 p.m. the boyfriend had to leave. As he did, the Snelling household got ready for bed and went to sleep. The house was now drenched in darkness and silence as the hours went by, the family deep in sleep, until shortly after 2 a.m. The 16-year-old girl woke up with a feeling of pressure. As her mind shook her awake, she realized that someone was laying on top of her. The stranger held his hand over her mouth and nose, and he had a tight grip onto her right arm. For a second she thought that her brother was pulling a prank on her, but she quickly saw the angry eyes staring at her just inches away from her face. She began to struggle a little bit, and the man told her that he was going to stab her if she screamed. She agreed not to scream, and the man removed the hand from her mouth. His voice sounded like a low growl. "You're coming with me," he told the frightened girl, and yanked her up from the bed as he pulled out a gun from his pocket. The same gun he had stolen during one of his ransackings. The stranger started pulling her out of the bedroom, and the young girl started to panic at the thought of what this fucking deviant was going to do to her. "Why are you doing this? Where are you taking me?" she asked, but he ignored her pleas. He kept pulling her through the house as she started to struggle. She was crying and trying to violently jerk back, but his grip was too strong. He had almost dragged her out of the house when she made one last effort and dug her heels into the floor. This made a loud noise, loud enough to wake her father up. The man dragged her out of the house and she kept crying and struggling. "Don't scream or I'll shoot you," the stranger growled again, but it was fight or flight at this point. She knew that whatever awaited her if she went with this man would be worse than what the gun could do to her. He dragged her through the back gate and under the carport when a loud voice came from the residence. "Hey, what's going on? What are you doing? Where are you going with my daughter?" It was her father. Claude Snelling was running through the house, and for a brief moment he stopped and his eyes met his daughter's. The strange man let go of the tight grip, and the girl fell halfway to the ground, exhausted and terrified. But the man didn't flee, he just stood there. He was waiting for Claude to come outside. Claude was fuming with anger and kept asking the stranger what he was doing as he made his way towards him. He was getting closer and kept asking where the man was taking his daughter, and that's when the man aimed the gun at Claude and pulled the trigger. The bullet struck Claude in the shoulder, and as he spun around, the man pulled the trigger again. The second bullet also struck Claude. Claude was now staggering back to the house in his pajamas, now covered in his blood. The man lowered the gun and pointed it at the young girl instead. I can't even imagine what must have been running through her head at this point, but as he did, she looked away, crying. She caught a glimpse of the man lowering the gun, but before he jogged away from the crime scene unscathed, he kicked the 16-year-old girl in the head a couple of times. As soon as he had jogged away, she ran back into her house, where her mother was tending to her father. They called an ambulance, but Claude Snelling, 45 years old, was pronounced dead upon arrival to the hospital. Terror had struck the town of Visalia. People mourned the loss of Claude, and several connections to the wicked ransacker was discovered. Not only the revolver, but also a flashlight that had been stolen at one of the Visalia ransacker crime scenes. It had been dumped nearby on the night of Claude Snelling's murder. He had gone too far this time. He had to be stopped. The ransacker wasn't deterred though. He kept prowling his way through October and even started making threatening phone calls to former victims. In one instance he called a female home alone and asked her if she would like to get fucked. Then she heard noise from her front door, but the ransacker never got inside. Then it was back to his usual pastime activities again, dumping pills down people's sinks and stealing single earrings. And these activities kept happening all throughout November as well, until December 10th. On the night of December 10th, he had committed one ransacking, stealing some small valuable items and some stamps. He had somehow managed to evade all the police patrols that had been set up since the murder of Claude Snelling. But every time he prowled or ransacked was a risk. Police had really been trying to catch him and set up special patrols. They had even scared him away a couple of times without even knowing it. But the night before, on the 9th, he had done something that would tighten the noose around him. He had been prowling on one of his previous victims, the 19-year-old girl that he had pushed down when she caught him in the middle of ransacking. Several months had gone by since that incident, but when she found shoe prints outside her house, she called the police. The police put up a stakeout at the location. They had one officer across the street from the home, and then they had Officer McGowan sitting in the garage of the next door neighbor to the victim. McGowan had been sitting in the dark garage for 2 hours when he saw a dark figure crouched down, sneaking around in front of it. The stranger peeked inside the garage, but he didn't see Officer McGowan. The stranger started making his way to the side of the garage, towards the back gate, and as he did, Officer McGowan began to silently follow him. McGowan saw the man stop to tamper with the lock to the backyard. It was a perfect moment. He had the element of surprise on his side, and so he aimed his flashlight at the man as well as his gun and turned the flashlight on. "Oh my god," the strange man screamed. "Oh my God, no," his voice high-pitched and frantic. "Hold it right there," McGowan shouted. The man started taking off his mask, and as he did, he darted for the fence and flung himself over it. "Hold it," McGowan yelled as he was following him over the fence. He noted how the man was running in a zigzag pattern. "Please don't hurt me," the man was screaming in a high-pitched voice. McGowan shot a warning shot in the air to alarm his partner as the man jumped over another fence, McGowan in pursuit. The chase went on and the man kept yelling to McGowan not to hurt him. Then he stopped. He was now standing only 5 feet away from McGowan as he began to turn around. But not all the way, only his right side could be seen in the light of the flashlight. "Look, my hands are up," he yelled at McGowan, raising his right hand. But his left hand was rustling around in his pocket. But before McGowan could do anything, the man spun around and fired a shot. The impact of the shot pushed McGowan to the ground and the Visalia ransacker escaped the scene as McGowan's partner ran to help him. He found McGowan lying on the ground, but McGowan had been lucky. The bullet had struck his flashlight and the only injury he had suffered was splinter from it getting into his eye. Police searched like crazy throughout the night, but the Visalia ransacker evaded capture. After that, things got quiet. He was a prowler in January of 1976, but he was finally gone. Visalia was free of their terrorist, and it wasn't until 2018 that the name Visalia ransacker got a face. The Visalia ransacker was only one of the many names the Golden State Killer has had throughout his deviant career in murder and terror, and he was constantly evolving. Because he left the moniker of Visalia ransacker that night he fired at McGowan. Instead he reinvented himself and became known as the East Area Rapist. Visalia was only the beginning.
Johnson said her assailant may be the East Area Rapist,
who terrorized the East Area of Sacramento.
Was wearing some type of a mask or a hood.
She was awakened while being blindfolded. She never saw her assailant.
Work of the East Area Rapist.
The young victim was attacked in her Rancho San Miguel home.
She was bound. He raped her.
It was in the summer of 1976 that the storm arrived in Sacramento. But this time, his new name would reflect the twisted inner workings that had evolved inside his head to spread fear and terror. Much like a terrorist, the East Area Rapist wanted to instill pure fear into people. It's like the fear was a drug, and he was the addict, always looking for a fix. She was 23 years old, living with her retired father. Although she would be alone on that dark summer night, they had moved to Rancho Cordova about a year earlier. But weird things started happening. She felt that she was being watched and she received hang-up phone calls, all very unnerving to the young woman, but she had no idea what was to come. June 18, 1976, 4 a.m. It was a night the young woman would never forget, a night that would traumatize and terrorize her for the rest of her life. As the woman was sleeping inside her bedroom, someone was creeping towards her house. The creeper attempted to cut her telephone wires from outside, but he was unsuccessful. Instead, he silently made his way to the back door of the house and made his way inside. The man was wearing a mask and he was wearing clothes, but he was naked from the waist down. Silently, the half-naked creep walked towards the woman's room, and then he stopped in her doorway. He just watched her for a little while, and then started tapping the knife he had brought against the door frame. The young woman was waking up, and when the masked stranger all of a sudden turned her bedroom light on, she started to scan the room. She focused on where the tapping had come from, and as the tapping continued, she saw him. A masked man. He had a black t-shirt on, and his dick was hard. Instinctively, she pulled her cover over her head as the creeper ran towards the bed. Then she felt his weight on top of her legs, and as she did, he yanked the cover off of her. Now she was staring into his eyes. The man took his knife and pressed it against her temple. He pressed it so hard that blood started to leak out, covering the poor girl's pillow. She was paralyzed, terror in its purest form. The man threatened to stick her with a knife if she made a move or a sound. Then he said, "I want to fuck you." He then ordered her to take all her clothes off and to remove the tampon she was wearing. She had been on her period, but the masked man didn't seem to care. Then he bound her with cloth. The East Area Rapist always bound his victims very tightly, many times causing severe pain and blood loss. After he had bound her, he ordered her to roll over. The man started raping her, and as he was touching her breasts with his gloved hands, she did everything she could to shut the world out. She was sure that she was going to die. The creep finished and wiped his dick off on her sheets. Then he asked if she had any money, but before she could answer, he hissed at her to shut up. The man started to scramble around in the bedroom until he found a hairdryer. He then bound her legs and feet together with a cord from the dryer. He also tied her ankles with a bra, and he covered her mouth with a white slip, tying it tightly around her head. He kept rummaging around the bedroom and then approached her again. This time he pressed the knife near her right eye and told her that if she made any noise while he was there, that he was going to kill her. She could then hear him ransack the house, pulling out drawers and rummage around the kitchen. He also seemed to be talking to himself, saying things like, "I told you to shut up." Then it got quiet. She couldn't hear him anymore. She began struggling against her bindings, but as she did, they only dug deeper. She had lost the feeling in her hands a while ago at this point, but she managed to get her legs free and to free her mouth. She ran to the phone, and at every turn she expected to see the masked man waiting for her. She tried one phone but couldn't reach it, and instead ran to her father's bedroom, where she managed to knock the phone off and call police. She was sobbing uncontrollably as she fell to the ground and pleaded for help. Her hands were still bound when police arrived. She was shaking and her teeth was shattering as she talked to the cops. But she did tell police that her attacker had a very small cock. But it wasn't the cock that would haunt her, it was the terror she had been through. They also found lube the creeper had brought with him. The rape and attack on the 23-year-old girl was only the first in a long line of sexual assaults. He committed 48 sexual assaults and attempted sexual assaults over a 3-year period. Going into detail on each and every assault would make this video extremely long, so some of them will only be mentioned briefly. A month had gone by when the East Area Rapist made his second appearance, this time in Carmichael. It was on the night of July 17 that the two sisters were sleeping in their beds. They were both home alone. One of them was 16 years old and the other was 15. Just kids. The two sisters stayed up that night watching TV before going to bed, and then in the middle of the night the younger sister woke up with a strange man covering her mouth. She panicked and the masked man hissed at her that if she didn't shut up he was going to kill her. He whispered through clenched teeth and he sounded angry, hateful. The 15-year-old girl managed to break away and hit his leg as she started running towards her sister's bedroom. But the man caught up with her and started hitting her, and after 3 or 4 blows he hissed at her that her sister was already tied up. He bound the girl with a string, again, very tightly, and told her that she needed to do everything he told her to. Then he shoved a sock into her mouth and tied something around her head to keep it there. Then he picked her up and carried her back into her bedroom. The stranger told the girl that he would kill her if she moved, and then he started to rummage around the house. He came back into the room to check on her several times during the ransacking, After some time, he came back with a towel that he tied over her eyes. And then he turned the lights on. Then, the frightened 15-year-old girl felt the man on top of her back. She felt something slippery in her tied hands. It smelled like baby lotion, and he was demanding her to, quote, play with it. Then the stranger asked the young girl if she had ever fucked before. She still had the sock in her mouth, so all she could do was shake her head. Then the stranger flipped her over so she was laying on her back. He untied her ankles and proceeded to rape her. It went on for a couple of minutes before it was done and tied her ankles up again. The stranger then asked the girl where the money was, and then started pulling out drawers.
I woke up with a hand over my mouth, and I rolled out of bed. I just swung my arm. I said, "What are you doing?" He was going down the hall, and he was just hitting me. And then I just pretended that he knocked me out so he'd quit hitting me. And then I sock stuffed in my mouth, blindfolded, gagged, hands tied, legs tied. And then, pulled me up like this, because I was on my stomach, and put me back in bed and said, "If you move, I'm going to kill you." So, lay there for 2 hours. And he came in, I don't know, I think 5 different times or something like that over the course of the night and raped me. And while you're laying there thinking you're going to die, you just are pretty sure that, I remember just kind of being in shock. I'm just laying there on my stomach shivering because I had a fever, and you know how you get the chills and you shake, so finally, after, our best guess is 2 hours. It went on a long time. At about 4:30 in the morning, I had heard a car drive away, and I started counting to 60 because I didn't have any concept of time. So I counted to 60 30 times, and I figured then a half hour would have gone by with no noise in the house, and I got up and didn't know if he was there. I used to say, and I'm sure that, who knows, that I remember saying when it was still going on, if they ever catch this guy, they should lay him on the floor and let everybody that he raped get to do whatever they want to him. I just thought that's what we should get to do.
After a little while, he went into the 16-year-old sister's room and rummaged around. Then he came back and told the 15-year-old that he had seen her on junior prom, and that he had known then that he had to fuck her. Although it's unlikely, he actually saw her there, as she had a photo of her and her boyfriend taken on prom on her dresser, and on the back of it she had written that it was taken on prom night. But the East Area Rapist wasn't done with the 15-year-old girl just yet. He again demanded her to play with his penis, and said that he was, quote, in love with her fucking body. Then he got up for a little while, but got on top of her again, this time raping her again. He wiped her legs off and demanded to know where the doctor's drugs were. How he knew that her father was a doctor is anyone's guess. Then things got quiet. About 30 minutes passed by, and the younger sister started loosening her bindings. She made her way to her sister's bedroom, where the 16-year-old was untying hers as well. Luckily enough, the masked man never raped the older sister. He focused all his sadistic rage on the younger sister. He had bound up the 16-year-old and pressed a knife against her neck, saying he would push it through her neck if she made any noise. Then he would come in from time to time and threaten to kill her, but he never touched her after tying her up. A true deviant was roaming around, and the storm was only just beginning to wreak havoc on Sacramento's suburbs. Another month passed by, and on August 29, he made his reappearance. He was back in Rancho Cordova again, the same neighborhood the cat burglar had targeted 4 years earlier, and in some instances, even the same houses were targeted. On this night, things were quiet in the house. The husband was off working, so the mother and her 2 daughters were home alone. The youngest daughter, a 12-year-old girl, had recently hung up wind chimes on her window curtain. She had gotten the wind chimes from a friend, but in the middle of the night she started to wake up from her sleep. She could hear the familiar noise the wind chimes made, and eventually she had woken up enough to look in their direction. There she saw a masked man trying to pry her window open, and when she spotted him, he stopped abruptly and stared at the young girl. Then he slowly lowered himself out of visibility, never breaking eye contact. As the masked man disappeared from her view, the young girl ran to her mother to wake her up. The mother woke up quickly. Filled with adrenaline, they went into the girl's room and looked out the window. She couldn't see anything and questioned whether her daughter had just had a nightmare, but the child insisted that she had seen a man with a mask trying to open her window. The mother and her child then went to wake up the second daughter of the household. The 15-year-old girl barely woke up and told her mom to call the police before falling back to sleep. The mother walked back to her youngest daughter's bedroom, and this time she froze in fear as she looked out the window. There she saw a masked stranger. As soon as she saw him, he turned around and ran towards the fence. As he did, the mother grabbed her daughter and ran to the phone to call police, but as they were waiting for an answer, she could hear a crash in her daughter's bedroom as the curtain rod and wind chimes fell to the floor. He was inside the house now. The mother was in panic as she was still waiting for someone to answer the phone when she saw the stranger make his way down the hallway. He was naked below the waist and he held a club in one hand and a gun in the other. "Freeze or I'll kill you," he said. "Hang up the phone now." "Who else is in the house?" he continued. The 12-year-old girl, frightened beyond imaginable, told him that only her sister was there. He was wearing a tight-fitted hooded mask and spoke through clenched teeth. He started walking towards the mother, who wasn't going to give up without a fight. Instinctively, she grabbed for the man's gun, and as she struggled for it, she could feel the club hit her head over and over again until she stopped struggling. He ordered them to sit on the couch, and then he approached the mother again, attempting to tie her wrists. She again made an attempt, and this time she was successful. She started fighting against the man to get free, and then she ran for the door. Meanwhile, the man kept hitting her over her head and shoulders with a club, so much that her face was now covered in blood. But she didn't stop, and managed to run to the neighbor with her 12-year-old daughter following her. They knocked on the door and the neighbor opened and called police. But she was still worried to death. Her 15-year-old daughter was still in the house. But then, she too turned up at the neighbor's home. She had heard her mother and sister plead with the attacker, as well as the struggle that had happened, and decided to jump out her window and run to the neighbor. Police arrived and started searching the scene immediately, but they couldn't find him. Later, a neighbor would state that she saw a man exit the house behind the family members, and then she saw him crouch behind a neighbor's bushes. He sat there just looking at them until he stood up and simply walked away, naked below the belt and a mask on his face. He wasn't always successful, but he got away with it for far too long. In the 2 months that followed, 5 more attacks occurred. The East Area Rapist had attacked a 29-year-old divorced woman in September, jumping her outside her parents' home as she had to wash her clothes there since her washing machine was broken. In that attack, he was a lot more violent and vicious. He hit her so much that he broke her nose and he masturbated on her. He also tied her up with white shoelaces. Her parents never managed to wash away all the blood that had been left on their doorstep. Maybe he was frustrated because his third attack had to be aborted. Whatever it was, he had hatred within him and he took it out on this poor woman. Then came October, and in October alone he struck 4 times. First he targeted a 29-year-old housewife. Her husband worked in the military. She had received hang-up phone calls a month before the attack and also had her home burglarized. Then he called again and she heard a man whisper to her that he was going to kill her husband. And it all exploded on October 5th, 1976. It was 5 a.m. in the morning and her husband had just left for work. That's when she started hearing clicking noises and told her 3-year-old son that his dad must have forgotten something. But then she heard footsteps. making their way down the hall, and she saw him, the masked man, the strange terrorist that was stalking the women of Sacramento. She screamed and pulled her son closer to her, and the man held up his knife and walked closer. He jabbed at her with the knife several times and put it against her neck, threatening to kill her son. Then she could hear him tear a cloth up before he tied her up. He roamed around the house for a bit and kept coming back to the bedroom. After some time he got on top of her, put his small dick in her tied up hands and told her to play with it. Then he raped her and again told her to play with it. She had also heard him move a chair to the front door, slowing down anyone entering the home, and shoelaces were also found on the crime scene. Then, on October 9th, another woman was attacked. This girl had been tied up and led outside to the patio, where he put her down on a rug and told her to play with it. Then he raped her. Then he left her there, and she didn't know what to do, so she waited in the house for 2 hours for her friend to show up. 2 hours just sitting there tied up in an empty house, knowing a masked sadist was lurking somewhere. It must have felt like forever. Then he was gone for a little while until October 17th, when he again targeted a mother and her son. The 10-year-old boy had woken up by the barking of the small family dog. Still half asleep, he got up to let the dog out into the backyard, but what he didn't know was that a masked stranger was lurking out there. As the boy watched the dog, he saw a figure. It was a masked man, naked from the waist down. Panicked, he ran to his mother to wake her up. The mother woke up and tried to call the police, but then she heard a loud thump and footsteps making their way down the hallway towards her bedroom. Then it all happened. The stranger put a knife against her throat and threatened her. She also had a 4-year-old daughter sleeping in another room, but luckily he didn't touch her. He tied her up, pulling the ripped strips tightly, and then he tied her frightened son to the headboard. He tied his feet together so violently that he got a cut that started seeping blood. Then he grabbed her and led her to the living room, where he sat her down on the couch. Then he put a blindfold over her eyes and a gag, before leading her back to the bedroom, where he ransacked the drawers. Then he again pulled her up and led her out to the living room. He had taken his mask and gloves off and started licking her. Then for some time he kept coming back to her, forcing her to perform oral sex. He raped her several times anally, and he at one point threatened to cut her fingers off if she didn't take her rings off. Then on October 18, he attacked a 19-year-old girl in a car. He forced her out of the car, bound her, and threatened to cut her guts out. She was scared to death and her dog was still in the car. He told her he would be gone for 5 minutes, but when he didn't return, she started loosening her restraints. Her car was missing, but it was found later. The dog had been locked inside the trunk, but it wasn't hurt. Then on November 10th, he struck again. This time he led his victim to the canal, but he didn't rape her. More than a month went by, then on December 18, 1976, the East Area Rapist attacked a 15-year-old girl home alone. He bound her arms and threatened her, saying he would kill her and that he would be gone in the dark. Then he led her out to the backyard, where he raped her. Again, shoelaces was found at the scene. He didn't attack again until January 18, 1977. On that day he attacked an Asian woman. He broke into her apartment in Sacramento, tied her up and raped her twice. Then he struck on January 24th, raping a woman, and on February 7th he attacked a woman home alone with her daughter. A struggle had occurred as she tried to get his gun, but she wasn't successful, and he hit her several times before masturbating over her and raping her. He also threatened to cut her daughter's ear off. Then on February 16, a man spotted a prowler. As he chased the prowler turned around and shot him. He survived, but the shooter got away, and it's still unclear whether the Ripon Court prowler was the Golden State Killer or not. But I don't have time to go into that, unfortunately. The East Area Rapist attacked 2 more times before he would change his MO, and in between the 2 attacks he made phone calls threatening to attack again.
Police Department, Sheriff speaking. You're not going to catch me. can't deny it. Be careful.
But it was after an article in a newspaper that the East Area Rapist decided that he needed to up his game. The article said that the East Area Rapist didn't dare attack when a man was present in the home, that he only attacked women alone. He must not have liked that very much, because it was after this that he started targeting couples, attacking not only the female, but do it with the man present. The Golden State Killer takes yet another step in his evolution. The East Area Rapist had been terrorizing the three communities of Citrus Heights, Rancho Cordova and Carmichael for almost a year. 15 attacks so far. But when the media challenged the depraved serial rapist, saying he only attacked lonely females, he struck again. This time he struck a household in Orangevale. It was April 2nd, 1977. In the house were 2 children and their mother, as well as the mother's boyfriend. She had separated from her husband, and the 4 of them had been out all night at a drive-in movie theater. The 2 kids were already asleep, and by 2 a.m. both of the adults had fallen asleep as well. That is until some time later. The woman was woken up by a bright light penetrating her eyelids. She slowly woke up. Still in REM sleep, she was dazed and confused. But as she opened her eyes, she looked at the light and then above the light. There she saw a white mask staring back at her. Then the masked intruder spoke. "Don't make a sound," he hissed through his clenched teeth. "Do you see this gun?" he asked. She said yes, and the intruder told her to wake the man up. She leaned over to her boyfriend and whispered to him that someone was in the house as she gently shook him awake. As the man was waking up, the beam from the flashlight focused on him instead. He started to get up from the bed when the masked intruder told him, "Stop, don't move, lay on your stomachs. I want your money." The man told him where it was, and the masked man said, "All I want is your money. If you cooperate, I'll be out of here in a couple of minutes. Get on your stomach and put your hands behind your back." Then he told the woman to tie the man up. "With what?" she asked the masked man, and that's when he pointed the flashlight at a couple of neatly laid out strings of shoelaces. "Do exactly as he says," the man told the woman. "Shut up, don't talk. Point your hands apart," the man responded. He ordered the woman to tie up her husband and then forced her to tie him tighter. He pointed the gun at the man's head and said, "Don't look up. If you see me, I'll have to kill you." Then the masked man retied him, this time tighter. Then he pulled up the woman, tied her hands and led her out to the family room. It was cold in the house. The back door had been opened and the plug to the furnace had been pulled out. He told her to lie down on the floor and then felt her feet being tied. He also wrapped a towel around her eyes. Then she could hear him going through the dishes, rattling them around. He came back and placed a cup and saucer on the woman's back. He told her that if she moved, he would hear it, and he would have to kill her. Then he started rattling around the kitchen again, and went into the room where the husband were. He put a plate and a saucer on his back too, and told him to lay still. The attack lasted for about an hour and a half, and during that time, he raped the woman 3 times. He also told her to, quote, "hold my cock," and he asked if the couple had fucked that night. And in between the assaults, he would roam around, go to the boyfriend and tell him to be still or he would kill him and everyone in the house. He also stood and ate food in the kitchen, chewing loudly. I hate loud chewing. Then she couldn't hear him anymore. He seemed to be gone. Finally, then she heard her boyfriend's voice call out to her, and then she felt him untying her. He had slithered his way into where she was. The man was gone. The attack was over, but the fucking terror never went away. And 7 almost identical attacks followed in the months that came. From April to September, he struck 7 times. The flashlight, saying he only needed money, placing dishes on the male victim's back, leading the female to another room where he rapes her and masturbates in front of her. Always shoelaces found at the scenes. In September, he had gone a bit outside his usual route though. That attack occurred in Stockton, but on October 1st he was back in Rancho Cordova. The name East Area Rapist was by now a household name. The residents knew about so much of the case that some of them immediately told police upon arrival that they had been raped by the East Area Rapist. Then he hit another couple. This was his 24th attack in total, and this time it wasn't a suburban middle-class couple he struck. The man was more of a biker, and the couple he attacked had been broken up. But as the girl had gone through an abortion just days earlier, she felt ill and decided to stay with her ex-boyfriend for the night. They had a violent argument that night, but eventually things simmered down and they both fell asleep. That's when once again a masked man slipped into the house, shined his flashlight in their eyes and threatened to kill them. Then he bound them, placed dishes on the man's back and raped the girl. They were a young couple. The man was only 21 years old and the girl was only 17. He raped her 2 times. Then he struck another couple. This time the female victim reported that she had been sobbing and crying after the second rape. Then he left them there to be untied by their small children. Then he attacked a woman and her 13-year-old daughter home alone. He woke the mother up and bound her. Then he went into the daughter's room, but she didn't react the way the others had. She was more dismissive towards his threats and still had her wits about her. She had read about him. She knew exactly who this was. It was the East Area Rapist. When he threatened to cut her ear off, he asked her if she wanted him to cut it off. She responded saying that she didn't care, and when he was going to rape her, he demanded her to roll over. She asked him why and then said that she didn't want to, challenging the masked stranger. Despite the bravery the 13-year-old kid had displayed, he still raped her, his youngest victim. This time he had attacked without a man in the house, something he hadn't done for several months. This same family had also been plagued with prowlings and phone calls. Then, on December 2nd, he attacked another woman home alone. Although her daughter was there too, no one got sexually assaulted. He did all the other things the same way as before. He shined a flashlight in her eyes, threatened her, told her he only wanted money and all of that usual shit he does. But for some reason he didn't rape her. But the terror was still there. That same month he called one of his victims up. When she answered, he said, "Merry Christmas, it's me again." The phone calls was something he did many times over the years. Even when the murder stopped in the late 80s, he still made phone calls to victims he had raped. He kept reminding them of what they had been forced to go through. 1977 ended and 1978 began. Do you remember the East Area Rapist's first victim? The first woman he raped after leaving Visalia. The young woman home alone hearing someone tapping on her doorframe. Her life had been hard since then. She had a lot to cope with. But in January of 1978, her life was finally starting to turn back to normal. But that day, she would be reminded. First the phone rang, and she heard someone ask, "Is Ray there?"
Got Ray there? Is Ray there?
Then the phone rang again, and as she picked it up, it was just silence at first. Then the deep breathing started. She wanted to hang up, but she had been told by police that he might call her, and she had gotten a tape recorder. So despite all her urges to hang up, she kept him on the line and let him talk, recording all of it. The breathing stopped, and instead the voice whispered angrily, "I'm gonna kill you." Before calling her a bitch and a fucking whore and so on and so forth. I played the recorded tape in my teaser, but I'll play it for you again. Here you go. On January 28, he attacked two teenage sisters home alone while their parents were at a concert. Same MO as usual, but this time he stole some photographs as well. There was something off about the East Area Rapist. He was always able to make his victims feel that they were going to die, despite the fact that the East Area Rapist hadn't killed anyone. Or, well, not anyone that they knew of. We know now that the Visalia ransacker was the same person as the East Area Rapist, and the ransacker had murdered Claude Snelling in 1975, his first victim as a serial killer, and it took more than 2 years before he claimed his next two victims. On February 2nd, 1978, the East Area Rapist murdered Katie and Brian Maggiore. He shot them both dead when they spotted him prowling while they were walking their dog. Brian was 21 years old, a young man working at the Air Force Base. His wife Katie was 20 years old. It was a night just like any other. It was around 9 p.m. and they were taking their dog for a walk, but something went horribly wrong during their walk. They spotted someone in the backyard, prowling. I'm not sure if Brian confronted the prowler, but somehow both him and his wife ended up in the backyard. The confrontation quickly turned violent. The prowler, who wasn't wearing his mask, didn't want any witnesses to see him. He picked up his gun and the Maggiores ran across a blown down fence nearby. And as they ran, the strange man shot them both, before he fled. There was a lot of commotion in the area as people were still awake and outside, but he got away. And Katie and Brian died of their wounds in the hospital. How could they have known? How could they have known that when they closed the door to their home that night to take the dog for a walk, that they would never open it again? That this was their last night on Earth? Later, police found shoelaces neatly placed out in the yard where the young couple was murdered. Almost 2 months had gone by since his last rape, and more than a month had gone by since the murders of Katie and Brian Maggiore. Then on March 18, he struck again. This time in North Stockton. Just like the other times, he woke the couple up with a flashlight and tied them up. Then he placed dishes on the man's back and sexually assaulted the wife. Then on April 14th, his last attack in Sacramento occurred. This time he attacked a 15-year-old girl babysitting for a neighbor, but the rape was interrupted as the victim's father arrived on the driveway with his car. He found her tied up in the backyard, her pants and underwear had been pulled down, and then just like in Visalia, he disappeared. But he never went away, he just focused on other areas. He moved his sadistic activities further south. He had so much more to do. It was June 5th, 1978, several miles south of his previous hunting ground. The masked stranger had now arrived in Modesto, California. A young couple was sleeping in their beds when a tapping sound woke them up from their sleep. They both fumbled awake and looked towards the doorway. As soon as they did, a beam of light hit their eyes. "Wake up, motherfuckers," the masked intruder hissed at the couple. "Get on your stomachs and put your hands behind your back." "Tie him up," he hissed at the young woman. She started tying her husband up. Then the masked man tied the woman and retied her husband before telling them not to move or he'd kill them. Then he started rummaging around in the house. He came back and told the woman to get off the bed. Then he placed the barrel of his gun towards the tied man's head and said, "If you make a move, I'm going to blow up your fucking kid." And I think we know by now what happened next. Does it need to be said? He placed dishes on the man's back, took the woman to another room where he raped her, and then tied her up with shoelaces. 2 days later, he attacked a lone female sleeping in her home. This time the East Area Rapist couldn't get his dick hard, but he still ordered her to play with his small penis. And he also raped her. Tiny and flaccid. On June 23rd, he attacked another couple in Modesto, and by now people were aware that the East Area Rapist never stopped. He had just changed playground. Just 1 day after, on June 24th, he attacked another couple in Davis, California. Again, he didn't seem to be able to get his dick hard, but that didn't stop him from raping and terrorizing. Then he went under the radar for a couple of weeks, until July 7th when he attacked a 33-year-old mother who had returned home from a date. Same MO as usual, but he did something odd this time. Something that didn't really make much sense until about a year ago. The masked man, after raping the woman, reportedly started sobbing, and he started saying, "I hate you, Bonnie," over and over. We'll talk more about Bonnie later. Things calmed down again. He was inactive for 3 months, but of course he came back. This time he targeted Contra Costa County, and his first attack in Contra Costa occurred in Concord on October 7th. The couple that were attacked that day had noted a prowler in their backyard a few days earlier. The man had confronted the prowler and told him to get off his property. This attack is just like the others. Same MO, same brutal sadistic mind games. On October 13th he hit another household, this time locking the couple's 8-year-old daughter in the bathroom while he was sexually assaulting the mother. People were on edge. They were arming themselves and taking turns staying up awake in fear of the rapist. He was almost more of a legend than an actual human being. So fucking elusive, so brutal, so inhuman. On October 28th, he attacked a couple in San Ramon. This time he forced the woman to perform oral sex, and then he came on her face. It's not what he usually did, but he had done things like it before. The woman, he jumped outside her parents' residence after his butchered attack on the mother and her kids comes to mind. But that attack was almost pure rage and hatred. This felt more like humiliation, as he also threw water on the woman's face. There were 3 more rapes in 1978, and 6 rapes in 1979. 48 attacks in the span of 3 years, as well as a double murder. So many lives traumatized. We're more than an hour into this, and we haven't even gotten to the murders yet, so I hope you understand why I couldn't detail every rape that occurred. Many of them were similar too, and I don't like repeating myself too much. One thing to note about his rape spree is that many of his victims had weird activities going on before and after the attacks. Many of them had prowlings and burglaries happen before the attacks. In one attack he had broken into the house and emptied the husband's shotgun before his attack. He also talked to himself a lot. Many of the female victims were harassed with phone calls. Some kept getting them years later. And then there was the guy that stood up during a town hall meeting questioning how any man could let his woman be raped like that. That same man would later be attacked by the East Area Rapist, and his wife would be raped. Humbling, I'm sure, but evil nonetheless. And as we noted before, the Golden State Killer was on a trajectory. It began in Visalia as the ransacker. Then he became a serial rapist. He murdered during these periods, 3 victims in total, but it would be in the fall of 1979 that he changed drastically. It began with a botched attack, this time he was in Santa Barbara County, California, in Goleta. He attacked the couple and had bound them, but when he was trying to assault the woman, the man got free of his bindings and ran outside to call for help. As he did, the masked man ran after him, scanning the backyard with his flashlight. While he was doing so, the woman got free as well, and she too ran out of the house, into the street. There she stopped the car, and lucky enough, inside the car was an off-duty FBI agent. He chased the suspect on a bicycle for a while, but the masked man got away. The East Area Rapist was gone. He would never return again. He would start anew under yet another name. This time though, he wouldn't be a serial rapist. He would be a serial killer. Because on December 30, the original Night Stalker made his first appearance in Goleta in Southern California. But it wouldn't be his last appearance. Days before the attempted murder of the Goleta couple, a prowler had been sighted. One man had been walking his dog without a leash, and the dog ran into someone's yard. When it returned to the man, it was bloody. Someone prowling in the yard had stabbed the dog several times. He had been more cautious in Northern California, when he was the East Area Rapist. He did kill 2 people, probably because they may have been able to identify him, but now he was on a new path. His first attack in Goleta was unsuccessful, but the man with 3 murders would keep himself active. By the time he fell back into the shadows, he had killed 13 people in total. On December 30th, 1979, the man who would years later be dubbed the original Night Stalker began his hauntings. He was never a ghost, but he might as well have been one at the time. It took until the year 2000 for these post-era murders to be connected, and it took until 2001 for the murders to be connected with the East Area Rapist. So it's safe to say that while Northern California still were on their toes, the masked stranger was moving south. He went from one neighborhood to the next. But it began on December 29th, Goleta, Santa Barbara County. People in the neighborhood had been experiencing prowling activity and burglaries. Glass sliding doors had been pried open, and tennis shoe prints were found. It was late on December 29th. It was almost midnight when the family arrived home and spotted a prowler in the yard. The prowler quickly turned around and jumped a nearby fence. The family entered their house and found the small poodle they owned dead. The prowler had beaten their dog to death, but to him, the night was still young. He disappeared in the darkness and things were quiet until 3 a.m. A neighbor living close to the home of Robert Offerman heard a gunshot. Then silence. Then there was 3 more shots fired in succession, and another pause. One last shot was fired, and then silence. Robert Offerman was a doctor, 44 years old, and on that night he had arrived home with his female colleague and psychiatrist, Deborah Manning, 35 years old. No one except for the killer can know what exactly happened inside the house that night. When police arrived to the condominium owned by Offerman, they found them both in the master bedroom. They were both dead and they were both naked. Deborah Manning was laying on her stomach, her hands tied behind her back, and a single gunshot wound to the back of her head. She had been executed. Robert Offerman was on the floor, his knees and head leaning to the floor, and his butt pointing straight outwards. He had been shot once in the chest and 3 times in the back. He also had a white cord around one of his wrists, a remnant of bindings that he probably had broken free of. They also found shoe prints on the scene, matching the prints they had found on the attempted murder 2 months earlier. As to the sequence of events, there is a theory of how it went down. We know the MO this guy has been using for years now. It's very likely he did something similar this time. He would have entered the house and then woke the couple up. Both Offerman and Manning had been sleeping nude, so their killer didn't remove it himself. Jewelry belonging to Manning had also been found, stuffed behind the mattress on the bed. So the masked man would have woken them up and told them he was going to rob them. Then he would have forced Deborah to tie Robert Offerman up. Then as he was tying Deborah up, Robert could have wiggled out of the bindings Deborah had tied. This hadn't happened to the masked man before. They had always been compliant. He always retied the male victim after the female had been tied. But when Robert Offerman got free and tried to confront the man, he pulled the trigger. Robert would have been hit in the chest and fallen to his knees when the man walked up behind him and fired 3 shots into his back. Then he turned around and executed Deborah. He never raped her, so at least he isn't a necrophiliac. Then he ate in their kitchen and threw a bag of turkey bones and scraps in their yard. The next door house had also been broken into, but it was empty, for sale. So police speculated that he may have been hiding there while police investigated the scene. And so the man with many names exited the 70s with a bang. He had been transformed now. He was no longer the East Area Rapist. He was a brand new kind of monster. He was a serial killer. The night of March 13th, 1980 was a dark night for Charlene and Lyman Smith. On that night a neighbor woke up to screams, but fell back to sleep, and days earlier another neighbor had seen a prowler in their backyard. This time the masked man had moved on to Ventura in Southern California, the Golden State. No one heard anything from the Smiths for a couple of days. Lyman Smith was a prominent attorney, 43 years old. He had a child from a previous relationship, a 12-year-old son, and on March 16, 3 days after the screams, his son entered the house as he was going to see his father and mow the lawn. Inside the house it was quiet, eerie, and there they were. 33-year-old Charlene Smith was laying on the bed, bludgeoned in the head with a fire log taken from outside the house. The log was laying on the floor by the bed. Police investigated the scene and found that Charlene had been struck in the head twice, and her hands had been tied with a white drapery cord. Lyman was lying naked on the bed, face down. His ankles were tied together with a string of cord. The killer had bludgeoned Lyman first, and he had raped Charlene Smith before murdering her. The prowling activities continued after the murder, as one neighbor found that someone had removed the window screen to his infant son's window. 2 more victims attributed to the Golden State Killer, but Charlene Smith had been tied with an odd knot known as a diamond knot. So for years the killer of the Smiths would be known as the Diamond Knot Killer. Police from Goleta and Ventura discussed whether their homicides could be connected or not, but they both concluded that they weren't. It would take some time before they truly knew that a serial killer had been among them. Summer came and the original Night Stalker moved on to Orange County. On August 19, 1980, Keith Harrington, 24 years old, and Patrice Harrington, 28 years old, became murder victims number 8 and 9, attributed to the Golden State Killer. He had entered the house through an unlocked door, as no forced entry could be found, and he was more organized this time around. He had gotten used to his new path in life as a killer. This time the killer had again bound them both. He had raped Patrice and placed a comforter over their heads. Then he started swinging. He bludgeoned them both to death, beating them through the comforter on the bed. He probably used the comforter to avoid getting blood splatter on himself. They weren't bound when they were found, as the killer this time had removed the bindings after killing them. The bindings had then just been left by the bed, but he brought the murder weapon with him this time. And that's how they were found, laying on the bed with a blood-soaked comforter draped over their heads. The killer had struck them so hard that a small brass fragment could be found in Keith Harrington's skull. It was unknown at first whether the semen found inside Patrice was the killer's or Keith's, but in 1996 DNA did confirm that it belonged to the killer. Manuela Withune, 28 years old, became the next victim. It was on February 6, 1981, as she was home alone, that the deviant struck again, this time in Irvine. Apparently she had been sleeping in her sleeping bag that night, and that's where she was found too. She had been tied up and raped before being placed back in her sleeping bag, and once inside the killer began beating her through the sleeping bag. Another bludgeoning, another death. This time though, he had attacked a lonely female. A female neighbor had noted that at the night of the murder she had arrived home and found her deadbolt open. It was odd, but she didn't see anything missing, so she went to sleep. Then he returned to Goleta in Santa Barbara County. It was in the summer of 1981, July 27th. He He was wrapped up in it now. He must have thought that he was unstoppable, but even though he killed his intended victims on this night, it was surely a humbling experience for the aging man. His crimes had spanned almost 10 years and he just wasn't as fit as he used to be. On that summer night, the original Night Stalker attacked 35-year-old Cherry Domingo and her 27-year-old friend Greg Sanchez. Cherry Domingo the bed. She was naked but covered in bedding. She had markings that indicated that she had been tied up with her ankles over her backside and tied to her wrists. She was murdered with a single blow to the head. Then there was Greg. Greg put up a fight against the attacker. It's likely he realized that the intruder was the same man that had killed Offerman and Manning not far away a year and a half earlier. However, it went down is unknown, but he had been struck in the head 24 times. To me that sounds like rage or adrenaline, or both. He had also been shot in the cheek, a gunshot that was heard by neighbors followed by screams. Detectives at the scene determined that Greg Sanchez was shot and struck in the head in a kneeling position. But he got up again to confront the attacker, and that's when he was struck in the head again. He would have stumbled to the closet and died. He was found halfway inside the closet and the killer had thrown clothing over his head. Again, strange activities occurred before and after the attack, but the confrontation must have left the depraved lunatic baffled. He wasn't as good as he thought. So, he went away. For 5 years he was gone. Not a peep. Not a fucking sound. But he had one more victim to claim. And as he disappeared, the East Area Rapist Task Force was shut down. The East Area Rapist had been long gone and the connection to the murders hadn't been made yet. He was lucky for a long time. But how could he have known about DNA? How could he have known that no matter how secure he felt, it wouldn't matter? When the lead detective Larry Crompton in Contra Costa County was asked about the East Area Rapist, he said he just emanated fear. It was knowledge that he wanted to kill somebody, and his victims realized it. That's why nobody fought him. We all have a flight or fight instinct, and when you think you might survive by doing something, you do it. You suffer through it for fear of death. But when he started killing people, that threat, that element of terror, went away. He was a killer, and Greg Sanchez could have known that doing as he said would be the worst thing to do. Many victims of the East Area Rapists knew that he didn't kill his victims. So when they were attacked, they knew that if they just gave him what he wanted, he would go away. But when you start murdering people left and right, you can't rely on threats, because the threats aren't as bad as what may happen if the threats aren't listened to. They become empty. That's probably why his last victim was a young girl home alone. Her name was Janelle Cruz, and she was 18 years old when she died. It was May 4th, 1986, and Janelle's parents were on a trip to Mexico. She was living in Irvine, and she had only been 8 years old when Claude Snelling was shot to death in Visalia. Time had certainly gone by. The Visalia ransacker was long gone. The East Area Rapist fell into obscurity except to those who were victimized by him. But the original Night Stalker wasn't gone yet. He would be soon, but not yet. Janelle had a male colleague at the house that evening. They weren't romantically involved or anything, they were just friends, but they started hearing weird noises around the house. It came from the garage, and it came from the backyard. But every time they looked outside, there wasn't anyone there. Janelle's friend had to leave, and so he did at about 10:30 p.m. Janelle didn't want to be alone. It was creepy. All the noises. Unfortunately, she would become the last victim of one of California's most elusive serial killers. She was found the day after, on May 5th. A real estate agent was going to preview the house and found her laying sideways across the bed. Police were alerted. Janelle hadn't been bound, but she had scrapes and marks on her wrists. She had been raped by her attacker and her head had been covered in a blanket. She, like the others, had been bludgeoned to death. Her head was full of blood beneath the blanket. It was a lot messier this time around, as blood was found in the kitchen, on the cabinets, on the front door, and by the head of the bed. The murder weapon would never be found, but a pipe wrench was missing from the backyard. There was also blades of grass found by her legs and feet. She had suffered a horrible fate, but no one could have known that he was going to come back. And just as he had killed again, he went back into the darkness. There were contacts made over the years, phone calls to previous victims, and as time went on, more crimes would be linked to the masked stranger. Technology got better, and by the late 2000s, all they needed was a match. But how could they get it? Would this madman ever be caught? The name was also an issue. The connection to Visalia wouldn't be made yet, so he would be known as Ear Hans, taking the first letters of East Area Rapist and Original Night Stalker and mashing them together. The name Original Night Stalker also came because he was California's Night Stalker before Richard Ramirez began his sixth spree of murders. But he got a new name, the Golden State Killer. Now you might just hear this name and think that it's just another serial killer, but the Golden State Killer is so much more than that. His spree began before he became a serial killer. He isn't like the Zodiac Killer or Ted Bundy. He is something similar but different. He is the epitome of a monster. A sick fucking cunt. A terrorist. A ghoul. I hope you don't mind my profanity. Sometimes you need to voice what you feel. So until 2018, not even a year ago, this was the story we knew. No name and no face, just a masked man preying on his victims. Then came the news. It was big news, and the circus is far from over at the time of making this video. He had been caught. Finally he was caught, and so it was revealed who he was, who he is. His name is Joseph James Deangelo.
And yesterday afternoon, in a perfectly executed arrest, my detectives arrested James Joseph Deangelo, 72 years old, living in Citrus Heights.
The news almost knocked me over. I had been following the case for 4 years, reading the books, looking through the theories, wondering if the Visalia ransacker was the same man as the East Area Rapist. Then the answers came. Joseph James Deangelo was the Visalia ransacker. Joseph James Deangelo was the East Area Rapist. Joseph James Deangelo was the original Night Stalker. Joseph James Deangelo is the Golden State Killer. He is the masked man, the deviant creep, the man that raped, terrorized and murdered his way through California. He had an advantage though. He was a police officer. I know the trial against him haven't even begun, and it's going to be one of the most expensive trials ever, so technically he hasn't been found guilty yet. But technicalities is technicalities. It's one-sided. And DNA rarely lie. Joseph Deangelo began his career as a police officer in Exeter, a town not far away from Visalia. It has been said that he witnessed his sister be raped in front of him when he was a young child. If it's true, it surely would have fucked his head up. But I've said it before, it's not an excuse. He also served in the military, not as an actual soldier but on the ship. During his time in the Navy, one of his fingers were blown off in an accident. After Exeter, he moved along to Auburn, where he worked as a police officer. Around the same time, the East Area Rapist attacks began. Then in 1979 he was fired. He had been caught shoplifting a hammer and dog repellent, something that could explain how he evaded dogs during his attacks. It was after his firing that the rapes stopped, and the murders began. Before the East Area Rapist attacks began, Joseph had been in love with a young woman named Bonnie. They were going to get married when she left him for another man. No one knew why the masked man had cried out, "I hate you, Bonnie," during one of his rapes. But now I think we might know. It's another one of those small details. Such an odd interaction, so random. Then all of a sudden there is an explanation. But maybe that's just chance. Joseph married another woman and had 2 daughters. His first daughter was born in 1981. The same year he took a break from killing. Then his second daughter was born in 1986, the same year of his last murder. Whatever he did next is unknown at this point. He lived his life as a free man, harassing former victims from time to time, but the noose was tightening. It was tightening around his throat, just like the bindings he used to tighten his victims. The DNA that belonged to the Golden State Killer was put into a genealogy site, and a match was found. It was a match to a distant relative of Joseph Deangelo, but the task force working to catch the killer worked their way down the family trees. They were working down it until they found Joseph Deangelo. They started following him. He was at this point 72 years old, and the year was 2018. Feels like yesterday. He was spry for such an old man, although he was a grumpy fuck. He was living with one of his daughters at the time, as well as his daughter's daughter, which would be his granddaughter. They didn't know he was being watched by the task force. They wanted to get his DNA. One day as old Joe threw a mug into a trash can. The police grabbed it and compared his DNA to that of the Golden State Killer's DNA. Go figure, it was a match. He was very surprised when they arrested him. He never thought the day would come. He had been living in Citrus Heights for years, one of the same neighborhoods he had struck as the East Area Rapist. There isn't much more to be said about him at this point. The trial is going to begin, and he is going to deny everything just like he has. He is an old man, so the truth of the matter is that we may never get all the answers. He's not very willing to talk, but still, he will die with the knowledge that we know. Everyone knows. He never got away with it. In the end he was caught, a miserable old man. His daughters knows. His granddaughters knows. They all know. That mask can't protect him anymore. He is naked. He is going to die alone. And you know what? That makes me glad.